What I wanted to do is put into conversation from a sociological perspective two of the most important 20th century public intellectuals dealing with war, peace, and violence. Erich Fromm, a German sociologist who studied with Alfred Weber, a critical theorist and a psychoanalyst, and then Noam Chomsky, the former MIT linguist and the great critic of the American empire. To do this, I'm going to start by reminding us a little bit about the long forgotten contributions of Fromm to public sociological thinking about war, peace, and Russia. And then I'm going to say a few things about what Fromm understood relevant to the current crisis that Chomsky does not. So Fromm was a great public sociologist, and he was also an influential peace activist of the 20th century. He was an early campaigner for nuclear disarmament. He confronted some of the major defense intellectuals in the United States who were arguing that, Herman Kahn in particular, was arguing that nuclear war was survivable. He was a human rights campaigner who gave significant money to Amnesty International in its early years. He had made a lot of money writing popular books. And he was a theorist of violence and war. And his writings and political engagement is relevant to the Ukraine crisis. He was a Marxist humanist born in 1900, but he wasn't that politically active until the mid-50s, when he got involved in anti-nuclear activism alongside his close friend, David Riesman, the Harvard sociologist. The organization SANE was a major anti-nuclear organization, was named after Fromm's book, The Sane Society, in 1955, published in 1955. And it was fear of global nuclear war that mobilized Fromm into political activism in the first place. He was a major campaigner against the Vietnam War, and he was in some ways the Noam Chomsky of the 1950s and early 60s, or in some ways, Chomsky is the Fromm of today. One of the things that he argued that I think is relevant is he argued that Russia was a conservative great power, not a revolutionary Marxist threat to the world. This was in a period of McCarthy's period, where there was where the Marxist threat to the world was stressed by American elites. He laid this out in The Sane Society, and he also wrote a book called May Man Prevail in 1961, where he argued that this case. He was also a leftist thinker who was deeply critical of Mao's China, which like Russia, he also saw emerging as a conservative great power, more likely to dominate its neighbors than revolutionize the world. Much of this is obvious today, but Fromm saw it early, and he saw that Russia would be a conservative bully in the region. Nothing revolutionary and progressive about this regime, despite residual sympathies some on the left may have for a dream that failed miserably. So my second point then is what Fromm understood that Chomsky doesn't. And I'm going to make 2 points here. First, I would say that Fromm understood that America is not the center of everything. And second, Fromm was able to bring in psychoanalytic insights into character that I would argue are essential to a sociology of war and peace. Now, despite his obvious radicalism, Chomsky, and Canadians see this, I think, pretty clearly, is a deeply American thinker. For all his critiques of American defense intellectuals and mandarins of power that he outlined so brilliantly, in some ways, people who argue that America can do no evil and is indeed the model for good in the world, Chomsky never managed to transcend this framework, only succeeding in turning it upside down. As a result, he ties himself into knots while opposing Putin. And I think it's important that we not smear Chomsky, and he's been smeared very often and in unfair ways. So he's opposing Putin, but in some sense, he makes the war the ultimate responsibility of the US and NATO. And the US is for Chomsky then, the center of all evil, and local details matter little. Fromm, in contrast, lived in Germany, the US, Mexico, and Switzerland. And his writings on American foreign policy always strike a better balance, seeing good and evil as existentially human forces, not national characters. He saw America both as a threat and a hope for the world. I think this is particularly important for American sociologists today, where this American-centric view, stressing American evil, is widespread and growing. It's an improvement on Cold War thinking and American exceptionalism, But thinking of W.E.B. Du Bois, an African-American public sociologist whose brilliant work is being rediscovered and canonized, so much of what he said about America in the 19th and 20th centuries is right on. But if one reads him on Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia in the 1950s, it is blatant Stalinist era apologies for the Russian Empire. So American militarism must be fair game for critique, but for Lithuanians, NATO was part of the solution, not the problem. Very complicated, I know, but I think Chomsky's obsessive thinking on these issues gets in the way of the obvious. A sociology of peacemaking here cannot be a simple story of good versus evil. My second part of the problem that I want to stress is that he is philosophically opposed to a psychoanalytic perspective. And I would argue that a psychosocial perspective that Fromm helped pioneer, where sociology meets psychoanalysis, is essential for understanding both Putin and Chomsky's own obsessive reaction to this war. Drawing here on David Brooks, a moderate Republican thinker, a New York Times columnist, that American sociologists love to hate. That's a whole other sociological puzzle that we could come back at another time. But in March of this year, he said, Putin's identity politics are so virulent because they are so narcissistic, just as individual narcissists appear to be inflated egoists, but are really insecure souls trying to cover their fragility. Narcissistic nations and groups that parade their power are often actually haunted by fear of their own weaknesses. Narcissists crave recognition, but they can never get enough. Narcissists crave psychic security, but act in self-destructive ways that ensure they are often under assault. We can think of Donald Trump as well. This quote could have been taken directly from, it wasn't, but it's very similar to Erich Fromm's classic Escape from Freedom. And I would argue that Chomsky's bird-eye view of the world, all filtered through his justified anger at the US and Vietnam, Latin America, and Iraq, blinds him to this psychosocial level. We could all learn, I would say, far more from what I would call the neo-Frommian or psychosocial analysis of Putin as the man without a face, and the broader analysis of Russian totalitarianism offered by Mashegeshin and others. So to conclude, I want to argue that from a sociological perspective, I would say that Chomsky's fame and his outsider status with a massive countercultural following has boxed him into a corner on the Ukraine. Fromm did a better job of being both an insider and outsider critic of America, with ties to liberal elites like the great American public sociologist David Riesman. And there's a whole story to be told about Fromm's relationship with the American liberal establishment, but also working and thinking outside of that mainstream consensus. I would call it a certain kind of optimal marginality that Fromm had, both inside and outside. But Chomsky, I think, didn't manage that. And so for many young sociologists and intellectuals in Canada and the US today, I'm really speaking from a North American perspective. I'm enjoying hearing the perspectives on this panel, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the day. Many are taking a hardline anti-NATO and anti-war positions. I think from this angle, revisiting Fromm's positions on this can help us move beyond the negative consequences of Chomsky's decades-long dominance among radical intellectuals on these kinds of issues. To succeed in this, however, we must both draw on Chomsky's principled universalism, his free speech commitments, and his powerful warnings on the danger of nuclear war, while critiquing his positions on the Ukraine. So thank you very much.